is live.
Hi.
Nidhi, will you forward the link on the Telegram group, the YouTube link?
Yeah, she's doing it.
Thank you.
Sir has already joined. Good afternoon, sir.
Hi, good afternoon.
Dr. Parui is Dr. Samantha.
I met
the
him the
associate
other day.
professor in Department of English.
Yeah, Shruti, I met him the other day.
Yeah, sorry.
In that, yeah.
Yeah. He was there. I mean, like, you people must have met on the digital humanities workshop.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
maybe
yeah.
can we begin? I think the link has been posted. I'm starting with the program formally.
The link is posted, Shruti. Maybe we can start.
Yeah, that is okay. So I formally welcome you all. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, the first thing that I want to share is that we're extremely delighted to get the enthusiastic responses and feedback for the live sessions that you people are giving. And probably this is the reason that we are up with one more live session. And today we have Dr. Abhishek Parui with us. I welcome you, sir, on behalf of the entire team of our 14th Faculty Induction Cum Orientation Program, and also on the behalf of participants. Well, to confess, sir, you are one of the best speakers I have ever heard. To enlist some of his achievements, Dr. Parui has distinguished achievements and exceptional contribution in the field of education. He has got his doctoral degree from Durham, UK. Currently an assistant professor in English and Memory Studies at IIT Madras, Dr. Parui is also an associate fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. He's the principal investigator of the Center of Memory Studies, MHRD, Government of India. He's the funding chairperson of Indian Network for Memory Studies. He has been working on various sponsored and consultancy projects. He's the author of Postmodern Literatures, published by Orient Black Swan, and his next book, Culture and the Literary Matter, Metaphor, Memory, is soon to be published. Along with it, Sir deserves praise for his extraordinary creative writing skills, many valuable journal articles, popular articles, and book chapters. He has been regularly invited for lectures at various reputed institutes. Sir has also taught and designed various NPTEL and SWIM courses. I've tried to be really brief about his immense accomplishments. We are glad and excited to listen to you, sir. I welcome you once again, and over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. That was a very kind and very generous introduction. And I'm very delighted to be back here in this institution. I hope I'm audible to everyone.
Yes, you are.
Excellent.
Perfect.
So it's always a pleasure speaking and interacting with your institution. This is my second engagement with this institute, and I do hope this is the beginning of a very long and fruitful collaboration in the times to come. So thank you for having me as a resource person in this FDP as well. And I look forward to the interactions at the end of my my session, my talk. So as some of you know, the title of my session is Memory Studies and Literary Studies, Interdisciplinary Possibilities. And I'm really going to pick up on the term possibilities because I will talk about the way in which literature or literary studies, which is my domain essentially, can connect to memory studies in a way that we study it today. And before I do that, I will try to give a definition of what I mean by memory studies. What is the definition? What is the working definition, shall we say, of memory studies? What are the different disciplines which are invested in memory studies? And in what ways can it connect to fiction, narration, storytelling, imagination, literariness, etc.? So first things first, what is memory studies? A very brief and working definition of memory studies would be it's a systematic engagement with human and cultural memory in terms of how it's a study of how human beings remember, how cultures remember, how memory becomes collective memory, shared memory, etc. So there is obviously the micro model of memory, the more psychological, sometimes medical, cognitive, clinical model of memory, which looks at brain behavior, brain memory, etc. And is also equally a more collective, a more shared model of memory, which we define in various terms, such as collective memory, shared memory, and obviously history. But we need to be very careful about making the difference between history and memory. Sometimes we tend to take these as interchangeable categories, but I'm a little wary about that. I think we need to make a definition about memory and history. History is a different kind of discourse. History is a more systematic, a more textual, a more standardized, a more uniform discourse of what you remember. And of course, there are different complexities to that, which I will touch upon subsequently. Now, this is something I say in almost all my sessions, so this might be repetitive to some of you, but I will still say it because it's important to define the discipline. And that is, in memory studies, we sometimes spend and sometimes ought to spend more time studying forgetting rather than remembering. Right? So forgetting becomes sometimes more important than remembering in terms of what gets forgotten, how something gets forgotten, what are the reasons why certain events get forgotten, etc. So again, I'm looking at forgetting, just like I'm looking at memory. I'm looking at forgetting as something which happens at a private, cerebral, neural, psychological level, but also something which happens at a more collective, shared, discursive level. So both ways forgetting works. So for instance, we forget things, human beings forget things, our brains forget things, but equally cultures forget certain things. Certain things are pushed into oblivion, right? And again, if you notice a verb, pushed into oblivion, it sort of goes somewhere, right? So there's a spatial quality about forgetting as well. It's not just temporal, it's also spatial. It is put somewhere, some space. So forgetting becomes a space in a certain sense. So it's important at the very outset to identify and define the spatio-temporal quality about memory and forgetting. It's not just enough to say that I remember something. When you're remembering something, you're remembering a space and a time together, right? We're not just remembering a time, not remembering a space, remembering a compound, a capsule of space and time. And one concept which I find very useful to theorize this kind of activity is the concept of the chronoton, which is something used by, literary scholars would know it. Mikhail Bakhtin, the famous Russian philosopher and formalist critic, who used the term, who made this term famous, essentially, chronoton. So chronoton, as the very name suggests, is a combination of chronos and topos. So chronos being time, as in chronological, and topos is obviously space, topography, etc. So what happens when you combine space and time, and we have this concept of chronoton, which is a very useful concept in my mind in memory studies, not just in terms of looking at memory, but also in terms of looking at forgetting. Because if we define forgetting as a spatio-temporal quality, it's important to define it through a chronoton. Right? So something becomes a lost space and lost time, an abundant space and time. And again, the notion of being abundant or being left over by time is a very important notion. And that can be studied in many forms. That can be studied emotionally, that can be studied even physically. If you take a look at, for instance, abundant buildings, abundant architecture, old temples, old monuments. So again, these are sort of lost in time to a certain extent. So these are left over in time. There's a sense of time having moved on from those buildings, from those sites, from those spaces. So these become very interesting chronotons in terms of being abundant by space and time. So I think what I have hoped to have sort of defined by now at this very brief introduction is looking at memory and forgetting as interesting spatio-temporal activities, but also, and this is the second point that I'm going to move on to, as connected activities. So memory and forgetting, or remembering and forgetting are not necessarily always opposites of each other. Remembering and forgetting become connected to each other in certain sense, right? So when certain things get remembered, certain other things also get forgotten at the same time. So even at a very scientific level, I'm just using a very basic foundational sort of scientific understanding of memory. Let's say a human subject experiences an event, whether it's a political event or an emotional event, or whatever the event may be. The subject's brain will encode that event into an experience in the mind, which will become a memory subsequently. Now, in the very process of encoding, there will always be already a process of erasure. In other words, encoding and erasure will happen simultaneously. So when the brain is remembering something, when the brain is encoding something into a pattern in the brain, which will become a memory. It is also erasing out certain bits. So, that's the reason why none of us have this idea of total recall, or we don't remember everything totally or completely. In fact, there are certain people who can do that, and that are studied in very interesting ways as interesting case studies, not necessarily healthy case studies, but rather as unhealthy case studies. So that can often lead to other kinds of problems. So in fact, there's a very interesting story that I do recommend, and I think I may have mentioned this in my earlier session too, and that's a story by Borges, the famous Argentinian writer Borges, a story called Funes the Memorious, F-U-N-E-S, Funes the Memorious, or Funes the Rememberer, that's the English translation. And it's a very interesting story, and I do recommend you all read it. You can Google it up. It should be available in translation. If you just write Borges and Funes, this will come up. And that is sometimes seen as a very interesting medical case study. It's about a boy called Funes who falls from a horse and gets hit on the head. And his disease is he cannot forget anything. He literally has to remember everything. And that becomes a problem. That becomes a medical condition. Because what happens subsequently in the story is something which is also medically corroborated, and that is the boy's ability to imagine things begins to disappear. The boy's ability for abstractions begin to disappear because he remembers literally everything. His brain becomes completely clogged with numbers and facts and figures. So he begins to miss out on the other very important aspect of the brain, which is imagination. Now that story is a very useful, it's very Kafkaesque kind of a story. It's very absurd in a very Kafkaesque way. It's not very Borgesian in a normal Borges way. So it's a very different kind of story that Borges, compared to what Borges normally writes. But I think what's interesting about the story is that it talks about how memory, forgetting, imagination, fabulation, all this become very connected activities. Now, fabulation is obviously a very important aspect in literature. And those of us who study and teach literature, whether it's the, classic realist novels and the more postmodern novels, whatever genre we are looking at, we sometimes find ourselves very interested in the idea of fabulation, the idea of making up stories, the idea of storytelling. So again, we're looking at storytelling as a private activity. Someone does it using language, but also storytelling as a collective cultural activity. So every culture will have its own stories. Every culture will have its own fairy tales. In fact, fairy tales is a very important study, a very important aspect in memory studies, because those contain very coded information about a certain culture, right? So we can tell a lot about a certain culture in terms of studying who are the heroes in that culture and who are the villains in that culture. That will tell us a lot about what the culture is, its biases, its proclivities, its xenophobia, its resentment, and all these things can come up in a study of villains and heroes and fairy tales. Right. So again, fairy tales become a very important aspect of collective memory in almost every culture. Right. So that fabulation becomes a very important aspect in remembering and forgetting, the idea of storytelling. Now, one very important aspect, and I'm going to bring this up because it's an FDP and I'm just interested in offering some research directions, and obviously I'm very interested in interacting with my colleagues and scholars subsequently as well. One very important aspect that I think can be tapped into in the study of this nature, memory, storytelling, etc., is the idea of narratology, especially cognitive narratology. And one person that I find very useful in a study of narratology is someone called David Harun. Now, Harun has a very good book, and I'm sure some of you are aware of it, and some of your research on this already, Storytelling and the Sciences of the Mind, where he talks about the different kinds of storytelling that takes place in different cultural activities, and how storytelling essentially is a very fundamental brain activity, that we as human beings, we as primates, are hardwired to tell stories. Right. So, there's a lot of work done on this, a lot of literature, people, a lot of writers theorize it differently. Salman Rushdie, for instance, in his book, Joseph Anton, he makes a very big claim saying that, human beings are the only storytelling animals. So we are the only ones who have the craft of telling stories through different medium. And that is very much part of our evolutionary machinery. The way we evolved as animals, as cultural animals, is through telling stories to each other. And one can define culture in a very broad sense. And this is the definition that I make, in a book that was very kindly mentioned by Dr. Jain, which will come up in December this year, which is Culture and Literary Matter, Metaphor, Memory. In that particular book, one of the claims that I make is that culture is essentially a storytelling activity. Right? So every culture evolves through storytelling, right? Evolves through certain kind of shared storytelling. If there's no storytelling, there'll be no culture. And the death of story and the death of culture, in a certain sense, are quite synchronous to each other. So, for instance, when a culture dies, one can also theorize it by saying that there are no more stories emerging from that culture about that culture, right? So when a language dies, when a culture dies, so that is related in a certain sense with the poverty of storytelling that emerges from that culture. And the contrary is also true in terms of how a culture becomes more enriched, how a culture becomes more complex, more hybrid, more inclusive, is through the proliferation of storytelling. More and more stories are told about that culture, from that culture. Now, by stories, I don't necessarily mean novels and fiction, which obviously is a part of that, but also cultural practices, discursive practices, gastronomy practices, textual practices. All these become part of the storytelling mechanism, the engine, the different engines, shall we say, through which a culture progresses, a culture evolves. Now, since I mentioned Rushdie, I think I should also mention a fascinating novel. In fact, this is my favorite Rushdie novel, something he wrote many, many years ago when he was in hiding, interestingly. This is Harun and a Sea of Stories. And I'm sure most of you read it. In my mind, that's the best work he's ever done. It's a fairy tale, but it's profoundly political. It is about situating imagination and storytelling against totalitarian political control. And obviously it's set in a fictional space and town, but it's about a professional storyteller and how the professional storyteller, he suffers an accident, a personal tragedy, as a result of which he loses the ability to tell stories anymore, right? And what's also interesting is that city is a city where people forget the name of their own city, and they forget what the city is called, they forget what a culture is called. And again, the death of the culture and the death of storytelling are connected together in very interesting ways. And of course, I'm not going to tell the story. Those of you who haven't read it, I do recommend read it. It's a brilliant novel. But towards the end, where the storytelling ability comes back to the professional storyteller, there's a rain, very symbolically, stories are coming back, and people remember the name of the city. And the name of the city is Kahani, which is story, which is a beautiful symbolic closure to the entire novel. And I think it's a beautiful, beautiful novel. Like I mentioned, I think it's the best thing he ever wrote. And this was written when there was a fatwa against him, when he was actually in hiding, which is when, so literally it was an underground novel, when no one quite knew where he was. And this was the time when he wrote Harun and a Sea of Stories. So I think that novel, of course, there are many examples one can think of. It's one of the best examples in modern literature, I think, which really equates memory and storytelling in a very interesting way, in a very metafictional way. In other words, what it tells us is that if we lose the ability to tell stories about ourselves to each other in different medium, it could be through Twitter, it could be through Instagram, it could be through novel, but essentially these are storytelling practices. If that runs out, if that dries out for some reason, what also happens is that particular culture begins to get dried out. That particular culture begins to get extinguished in a certain sense, right? So storytelling is almost like a biological functioning of a certain kind of culture. For every culture to evolve, it must evolve through stories. It must remember through stories. So again, we can sort of look at the word remember with a hyphen, member. It must be able to member itself again and again, right, through different kinds of stories. It must be able to progress. It must be able to evolve through different kinds of storytelling practices. So I think the connection between memory studies and literary studies is quite evident. I mean, there are numerous novels that one can think of, but let me just take a little digression from here and begin to be a little bit technical. I don't want to be too technical, but just going back to the idea of narratology that Herman talks about, and then I'm going to connect that to a neuroscientist who works in memory. So let's just start with Herman first. So in that particular book, Storytelling and the Sciences of the Mind, what Herman says is something which even the Russian formalists earlier had said. People like Vladimir Prof, for instance, they talked about how every culture will have its unique plots through which that culture will keep creating stories. Now, Herman, in that book, Storytelling and Sciences of the Mind, he says that every culture will evolve to certain kind of chunks. So, chunking is a very important concept in Herman. That certain chunks are taken and those are converted into stories, right? And certain privileged chunks become more popular stories. So, for instance, if we talk about any staple stories, even in Bollywood for the matter, you find there are some staple plots which get represented again and again. Feuding families, boy and a girl from different families coming together, and then there's a crisis. Or the other important story, there's a quiet town when nothing happens, and an outsider comes to the town. So these are the ancient plots through which different kinds of representations have taken place. Now, what Herman says, interestingly, is that storytelling takes place through chunking. Certain information is chunked together, and then it becomes a story. Right, so this process of chunking is quite complex, and to a certain extent is quite random as well. There's not much of a logic in what gets chunked and what gets not chunked. But the information which gets chunked becomes a story for a certain culture, which obviously then gets more dressed up and more embellished and become fairy tales or cinema or whatever the case may be. Well, the idea of chunking is very important in Herman's discourse on storytelling and sciences of the mind. Now, interestingly, if you take a look at some neuroscientific work on memory, and the person that I do recommend very heavily is someone called Joseph Ledoux. Ledoux, Ledous, Joseph Ledoux. He's got a series of very, very interesting books. The famous ones are the synaptic self. His work is very famous on the synapses. So he's a neuroscientist and he works on synapses. So synapses being the spaces between the two neurons, right? That's where, so he claims that the communication that takes place in a neural way takes place through synapses, not so much through neurons, but the space between the two neurons where the electrochemical reactions pass. Now, Ledoux, in a very interesting sense, uses the exact same metaphor of chunking when he talks about memory. And this is why it really gets interesting, because we have someone like Harun, who's a narratologist, who talks about storytelling and a cultural activity, where he's saying that certain information gets chunked into stories, and those chunks become fairy tales, movies, different kinds of representations and narratives. And we have a neuroscientist who's a hardcore scientist looking at the human brain, where he's using the exact same metaphor of chunking, and he's saying that a brain works by chunking information. So certain information gets chunked together, and those become neural patterns, those become meaningful patterns, etc. Now, the reason why I'm spending some time looking at this metaphor of chunking, because the moment we say something gets chunked together, what is also true simultaneously is that something gets chunked out, right? The moment you say something is brought together, the obvious implication is something is left out of that club. So there is a selective quality about storytelling. There's a selective quality about memory, and this is why it becomes really connected, literary studies and memory studies. Because if you go back to the earliest examples of fiction, whether it's a Western fiction or Indian fiction, who tells a story is a very important concept. The prism through which a story is being told, the narrator, whether it's in Mahabharata, whether it's in postmodern novels, whatever the case may be, the storyteller's position is very, very important, right? The focal point, to use a camera metaphor, the focal point through which a story is being told, the focalization through which a novel is happening. So even in a classic realist novel, for instance, there's a storyteller through which the novel evolves. So that focal point is very, very important. So there is a certain selective quality about storytelling, which obviously means that a person telling a story would have their own cognitive biases. And that cognitive bias can become more political, it can be racial, it can be gendered, it can be all kinds of things. But there is an innate bias about the entire activity of storytelling. And now that bias, interestingly, is also prevalent in memory. So for instance, if all of us in this room were to experience an event or an incident together, it could be something very banal, something very domestic. But the important thing is all of us would remember it differently. Right? So there will be different kinds of biases that our brains will attach to. So some of us would have a bias for color, some of us would have a bias for sound. It depends on how the brain is biased. So the brain is essentially a very biased machine. It's hardwired to be biased, and I think that's what makes us uniquely human. That's what makes every person different from everyone else. That's the whole idea of subjectivity comes in as a very philosophical condition. So when you talk about emplotment in literary studies, when you talk about focalization in literary studies, when you talk about narrativity in literary studies, these are concepts which can be applied very interestingly with memory studies in terms of who does the remembering, right? Who is remembering for us? Who is representing for us? Which is a focal point? Which is a political point? Which is a privileged point to which a memory is being remembered and obviously being retold? Now, just to give you some very banal, almost vulgar examples. I mean, this is from Hollywood. So for instance, as some of you know, many years ago, around 2006, I think, there was a disgusting film made in Hollywood called 300. I'm sure some of you may have seen it. It was made into a graphic novel later. So 300 was a good old Greek story about 300 Greek soldiers led by Herodotus. No, it was written by Herodotus, the historian, but 300 Greek soldiers who went and fought 1 million Persian army, apparently, right? And it was a big battle. And obviously the Greeks won, right? And the entire history was written by a person called Herodotus, the Greek historian, who obviously was on a payroll of the Greek kings. I mean, he had to write that story. Now, what's interesting is that absurd story of 300 soldiers fighting 1 million Persians and defeating them, in a very spectacular way. That absurdity of that story is not just legitimized in popular discourse, it is celebrated to the extent that a major Hollywood production with A-list Hollywood actors, I mean, I think there was Sharon Butler, big people at the time, who featured in that movie, 300. And it was obviously a very vulgar film. It was a very vulgar representation of history, very biased, extremely racist in different ways. It was banned in different countries, including Iran, for very valid reasons, I think. But if you take a look at that film, what gets interesting is that a seemingly absurd event, which could not possibly have happened, right, is remembered. Not just remembered, it is retold over and over again in popular discourses and collective memory, to the extent that when we watch a film, so we are complete outsiders away. We're not Persians, we're not Greeks, but the way the film is told, the way the remembering is happening in that film, we are made to cheer for the Greeks. Right? We are made to sort of side with the Greeks. And that is really the complex question. That is a really political question. And this is where memory studies begins to become very political. Right? Because what is becomes sometimes very political choice. So what do you choose to remember and what do you choose to not remember? This movie is an extreme vulgar example of that. I want to think of more, but the whole point, the reason why I'm choosing that film, 300, is because it is choosing to portray a certain kind of white supremacy, right? In a very, very embellished, aesthetic kind of a way. What it's essentially telling us, and Iraq war, around the American-Iraq war, so it was that kind of a political climate which produced that film. So nothing is innocent away, as you can all imagine. So there's a certain kind of white supremacist position which is being created with the production of a film like that, which is a very absurdist kind of film. Well, the interesting thing is, memory can be used in a very political way, in a very ideological way, to corroborate certain kind of impulses of the present. Right, and that we can find examples of that in any country, any part of the world, at any time, where a certain kind of memory, a very selectionist memory, a very biased memory, maybe entirely false memory, something which never took place, can be recreated in a very political way, in a very motivated way, in order to legitimize a certain kind of ideological impulse of the present. Right now, when we talk about these, we are looking at memory as a collective activity. We're looking at memory as a very biased activity. But the whole point of memory studies, and this is the point that I personally find very interesting, is to look at the interface between the micro model of memory and the macro model of memory. The micro being the brain model of memory. We find there are biases in the brain. There's a focal point in the brain. There's a very selectionist quality about the brain. And you find the exact same structures replicated, even the more macro models, our culture remembers, right? And I think I I use example earlier too, in the earlier session, where I talked about my experience when I was in my PhD, my experience with a British friend of mine. We were watching a film together, and this was a film called Rang De Basanti. And he wanted to watch a Bollywood film, so I was playing that film, Rang De Basanti. And there was a scene in the film, those of you who've seen it would remember the scene where the Jallianwala Bagh massacre is shown, right? And this British friend of mine, otherwise very liberal, very critical of imperialism, very open about so many other things, he gets very uneasy, and he asks me this very strange question about whether this actually took place in the history of the empire. And I said, I mean, you're surely joking. I mean, you don't know this massacre happened. I mean, this is one of the most brutal massacres that took place in the British Indian imperial history. And he said he doesn't know it. And the reason why he doesn't know it is very simply because it's never taught in the British history textbooks. Now, that was, I mean, I was in my first year of PhD at that point of time, but that was one of those moments of epiphany when you realize you need to do a research in this direction, in the sense that why are certain things forgotten in a certain cultural imaginary? Why are certain things forgotten in a certain nationalist imaginary? So every nation will have its own memorials, will have its own commemoration, certain events will be remembered again and again, very pompously. I mean, ask any British person about the Second World War, and he will sing praises about Winston Churchill. But no one remembers the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Now, I brought up Churchill very deliberately over here, because it's another reference I want to make, which is also about Churchill, and which is also about forgetting in a certain sense. Now, one of the problems in memory studies, and I think I may have mentioned this earlier somewhere else, or maybe in the earlier session that we had in this institution too, is the moment we say we do memory studies, there's an automatic assumption on the part, especially among the Western scholars, that this has to be at some point associated, related about the Holocaust, Second World War, Holocaust, trauma, etc. Now, obviously, this is a very serious study. A lot of scholarship has happened on Holocaust, and it should happen. I am, absolutely in favor of all kinds of studies about the Holocaust, and there are new things I'm sure that can be, found out, researched, etc. Now, but I often point out something which I think is a bit of an irony, and that is during the Holocaust, when the Holocaust was happening in the Second World War at Auschwitz, when so many Jews were very brutally massacred and murdered, one of the most inglorious episodes in human history. A very similar thing was happening in our country, in Calcutta, where I come from, in West Bengal, Bengal at that point of time. Very few people in India know about it. And forget about people in the West. The Holocaust is a global industry. The moment you say Holocaust, that just becomes the trauma, institutional trauma. Any Hollywood producer will pump out money if you say you're going to make a Holocaust film. So that just becomes the big thing in memory studies. Again, I'm not in any way saying that it should not happen. Obviously, it should happen. Obviously, there should be a lot of research and representation about the Holocaust. It was a brutal, inglorious tragedy in human history. But at the same time, as the Holocaust was happening, something similar happened in West Bengal, which actually killed more people than the number of Jews who died in the Holocaust, and that was the Bengal famine. Now, the Bengal famine, ironically, had very little to do with a natural famine. It was more of an orchestrated famine. It just simply happened, and a lot of research done by economists that you should read up if you're interested. It happened simply because the British stopped the food supply in Bengal and redirected the food for the army, which is, fighting the Second World War. So the British thought in their infinite wisdom that, the food should go to the army because, the army people need that food because they're fighting the war. So, obviously, who cares about the poor Bengal farmers? Let them die on the streets of Calcutta, which is exactly what happened. There are photographs of dead children being pecked by vultures in the streets of Calcutta. This is the street of Calcutta we're talking about, right? And there are photographs of heaps and heaps of dead bodies of poor people, farmers, children, women, naked dead bodies on the streets of Calcutta. Now, how many of us know of a single film made on the Bengal famine, right? Forget about Hollywood. In India, in Bollywood, in Bengali film industry, how many of us know of a Bengal famine film? How many of us know of a Bengal famine literary novel? Very few. Even the literature in Bengal at that time had very peripheral, tangential references to the Bengal famine. If you read, for instance, the detective fiction of Byomkesh Bakshi, there are a few very peripheral references to the Bengal famine at that time. Very, very few. It's like you blink and miss those references at all. Now, the great Winston Churchill, and the reason why I brought up Churchill earlier, when he was informed about the Bengal famine, that we need to release some food, I mean, there are people dying in the streets of Calcutta, Churchill's response was, if it is so bad, how come Gandhi is still alive? Let Gandhi die first, and then I'll release the food. And this was a guy who won the Nobel Peace Prize. So the point I'm trying to make is, and this is a person who was voted as the greatest Englishman ever in all popular polls in Britain at that time. So the point I'm trying to make is bias in memory, a bias in history, a bias in representation works in very, very political ways. So memory studies must take into account the politics of remembering and the politics of forgotten. It must study why the Holocaust is remembered again and again through different novels, different graphic novels, different movies, and why some of the Bengal famine, which happened exactly the same time, which killed more people than the Holocaust, is not remembered, right? Is unremembered, right? So there are different politics which are invested in processes of remembering and forgetting. So I think this is where literary studies comes in as a very potent instrument, because how do you define literature? How do you define fiction, for instance? And this is my working definition of fiction, which I use in a book that I'm writing, finished writing, thank God for that, which is looking at fiction as a combination of reality and possibility, right? Fiction as a combination, a very asymmetric combination, I should say, of what really took place with what could have taken place, right? And sometimes you mix it up further and add the other dimension, what should have taken place. And then you mix it up and make a very messy mixture of actuality, reality, and possibility. And this is exactly why fiction can be subversive. And this is exactly why novels get banned more often than history books, right? Because if you think about it logically, why would you ban a work of fiction? It's not really claiming to be true. I mean, it's just fiction. So why is there so much problem about, a novel that to the extent that you burn a book or, release a death sentence against the writer or, do all these ridiculous things? And that is because fiction has the potential to move, right? It's a very mobile, effective medium. It's not just telling you what happened. It is also moving you in the process of telling. So this is exactly why fiction and memory can work very well together. Because we need to remember the memory is also, it's not just a neural activity, it's not just a reconstructive activity, it is also an emotional activity. Memory can be emotional. Memory can be, it can be emotional in a very innocent, nice, Christian way. You dip up cake in a tea and remember your grandmother. That can also happen. Although I should digress, where he eats his Madeleine and tea, and he has this wonderful epiphany about his childhood. I don't know if anyone's eaten any Madeleine biscuit ever. I had that once. It was disgusting. I have no idea how someone can remember happy memories eating that biscuit. But anyway, to each his own. But the whole point is, the whole idea of remembering can be emotional in a very nice, ways, but also very political, aspects. So what's remembered, picked, what's chosen to be remembered, something. And that the medium of narration, the medium of the narrative becomes very, very important.
I think Professor Paroi might be having some connectivity.
Yeah, there's a connectivity problem.
We have lost it. He's not.
Oh, we have lost him actually.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think Professor Paroi.
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. That connection in IIT Madras today is very bad. So anyway, so I think if we could just remind you this now, I will just bring the session to an end by saying that the relationship between memory studies and literary studies is very complex and very promising. And that's the reason why I've titled my session as Research Possibilities, because we can look at the very good old techniques of literature, focalization, defamiliarization, narrativity, unreliable narration, bias, the whole idea of narrative bias, and apply that to memory in micro-psychological ways, as well as collective discursive ways. And I think research findings from that application, that mapping between the two disciplines, can be quite promising. So I will end with this, and I'm happy to answer questions if there are any. Thank you again for your attention.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. I mean, I think you have presented both the sides, that how you know it literary studies, through literary studies we can reconstruct, through memory we can, it is a reconstructive activity, and through memory studies and literary studies together we can actually reconstruct the erased past, or the things that have been forgotten, and at the same time you have also opened up the space to think that how art form can actually come to rescue for all those parts of memories that have been evaded and taken away from uh, the collective memory. As you said, that maybe it's a public forgetting, or as you cited the example of that British friend of yours, that he doesn't even know. I mean, at that point of time, he didn't even know the Jallianwala Bagh incidents, and how art forms then can come to rescue. So yes, a lot of research opportunities have been paved through the lecture. Anyone else?
Can I ask, Shruti, can I ask something?
Yes, please, please.
Yeah, Professor Parui, thank you again very much. Your lectures are absolutely fascinating to listen to. You speak on areas that kind of merge into our areas of literature studies. We also kind of go into memory when we study particularly modern literature, when we are doing Virginia Woolf or Henry James, and the entire idea about time and space and all that. But as I was listening to a very fascinating speech, I just remembered that your mentioning of the 1940 famine in Bengal is, I think, very pertinent. And you're right that 1947, the partition is remembered, re-remembered, reconstructed, and of course reused for all kinds of purposes. Whereas the 43, Durbikho, as we call it in Bengali, is kind of erased. But I just wanted to, it just came to my mind that Satyajit Ray made a film on Bibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay's story on the famine, which was Oshoni Sanket. This is a 1973 film that Ray made on that thing, which is it's a very interesting thing about how a filmmaker is actually reconstructing the events of that. So it's a modern look into, it's a contemporary look into something that had happened before. And also I remember, and I have seen also sketches and paintings by Joinul Abidin, a very famous Bengali artist who made absolutely fascinating sketches about what you just mentioned about, starving dead people on the streets of Kolkata. So my question is a little personal. You see, sir, my father was around 23 or 24 years old when he actually was in Calcutta witnessing this famine in Kolkata. And he was also in some ways a victim. He also didn't have food and many other things. Now, all those stories were told to me by my father. I did not experience the famine firsthand. I have heard it from my father. But now, as a 60-year-old man, when I remember those stories, it's almost memory. It's something that seems to me as if I have experienced it. My father was a great storyteller, no doubt about it. I mean, he was a very graphic. He was an artist himself, so he could, he told these stories with great details, and I have reconstructed it in my mind. To me, it almost seems I've lived it, and it's something which is within me. How do you see this? as a student of memory studies, how does this memory work? Memory of memory, I sometimes think, did my father make up some of those stories? Did it really happen? Was it true that he saw two people fighting over food on a dustbin, over a dead body? Was that true, or did he also make it up? I mean, how do I look at this in terms of truth, post-truth, my truth, whose truth, and this memory? I mean, this is one question. I mean, I'd like just your observations on this. And the other thing, sir, is remembering and forgetting, and sound and silence. Are they? Can they be related? Remembering and forgetting, and sound and silence. Is forgetting is equal to silence or silencing? Holocaust is also to do with silencing as much as it is to do with silence. So I just wanted to share some of my thoughts that came to me while you were speaking. And thank you so much, sir. This has been a very fascinating afternoon.
Well, thank you very much, sir. I mean, it was these are very important questions. So I will address your first question first, the whole idea of remembering through listening to other stories. I mean, there's a technical term for it called post-memory that Mariana Hirsch has used quite effectively. The whole idea about an intergenerational memory of a trauma, of something that you've heard from your ancestors or fathers. And to the extent, like you said, to the extent that it often becomes an embodied memory, almost like, it's so internalized that it becomes part of your body memory. It's almost like you feel the trauma, you feel that, the suffering to the large extent. And that is exactly the point I was trying to make when I was talking about the affective potential of storytelling, right? So for a story to really work well, whether it's a micro story told by a grandmother to a grandchild, or whether it's a Hollywood film, produced by Harvey Weinstein. I hope Harvey Weinstein doesn't produce any more movies. But the whole idea is it should not just be effective, it should also be affective, right? There must be a very high emotional quotient in those stories in order for the encoding to happen to such an extent that a person consuming those stories will begin to have an embodied knowledge of that story. Now, there's a very interesting scene in Art Spiegelman's graphic novel Mouse, where there's a very similar incident about a second-generation Jew in America who didn't really go through the Holocaust, but he's listening to the story of Holocaust from his father. And then there's this, the iconic scene in the Holocaust where the Jews are put together in a small washroom space and gassed together through a shower. And that's the effective way to kill them entirely. Now, he's heard the story so many times that there's a moment in that novel where he's going to take a shower in a school bathroom or maybe in a domestic space. And suddenly the hot water from the shower reminds him of the gassing of the Jews, despite the fact that he hasn't been there. It's something he has listened to so many times, to a very effective storytelling mode. And so this is the quality of effect. This is the power of effect to a large extent, that it can make people remember things which they haven't experienced. Now, this can actually become very political in many ways, as I'm sure you'll agree. If you can manage to remind a certain culture or remind a certain generation about some atrocity which may or may not have happened at some point of time and mobilize them against certain other culture. I mean, there are numerous examples in our country as well as outside where this has been handled and abused by certain totalitarian forces. So who tells a story? Who controls the engine of storytelling, right, at a cultural level? That becomes a very key political question at many points of time. And your second question is again fascinating, the idea of silence and forgetting, because a large part of forgetting is unremembering. If we could use the word unremembering rather than forgetting, I think it really helps us theorize it better to a large extent, right? So you unremember it because you're not telling the story about it, right? You're not narrating it anymore. You're unremembering it because you're not representing it anymore. So again, we're looking at the very interesting equation between remembering and representing. And this is exactly literature and memory studies wedding together. This is a happy wedding of remembering and representation. And if you don't remember, you don't represent, re-present. So silencing is the absence of representation to a large extent, right? So silencing, and this is, I'm very glad you asked this question, because in my book, I look at silence and forgetting exactly like this. I look at forgetting not as something which is passive. I look at forgetting as something which is produced. You produce an absence by unnarration. You produce an absence by unrepresentation, right? You don't talk about that anymore. And not talking also becomes an activity to a certain extent. You're not allowed to talk. The state forbids you from talking. I mean, for instance, if you read, the works of Milan Kundera, and it's fascinating, the Book of Laughter and Forgetting, which is exactly about that. A certain generation is not allowed to talk about certain things. And by not talking about certain things, they produce this collective amnesia. Right? So again, we're looking at forgetting as an act of production rather than just a passive consumption of something. So thank you again for your fascinating questions. And I'd love to interact with you at length. If you could drop me an email, sir, that'd be great.
Yeah, we will. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Thank you. I was thinking of Adorno. I was thinking of Elie Wiesel's novel, which is called Night, where he actually talks about forgetting and silencing. So those were the references. Thank you so much, sir.
I mean, Adorno is interesting, isn't it? Because he actually has a statement that there's no poetry after Auschwitz.
That's right.
After the Holocaust happens, you should not remember it. It's almost like a moral thing to remember.
That's right.
So
that's right. Yeah.
I think Aparajita has a question.
Yes, thank you, Shruti. Thank you, Professor Parui, for that very interesting, fascinating lecture. I am not from literature, but literature has always fascinated me. And since childhood, I have read a lot and tried to read a lot, but I wouldn't say I have read a lot. But yes, Oshoni Shanket was also the movie that came to my mind when you spoke about the Bengal famine. And I think many Bengalis will relate to this, and they may have watched this at some point in their life. My question, sir, is I just wanted your thoughts on memory, storytelling, and mythology. And how do you think that memory and storytelling gets passed on through generations through mythology and mythological texts, especially when there may be a lot of distortion and there might be a lot of different viewpoints as well. Just say, for example, say Mahabharata or Ramayana, this has been presented to us in a very different form. But when you say look at Devdutt Patnaik's work on the same Mahabharata and Ramayana from the perspective of Jaya or from the perspective of, so it is completely a different story. So how does mythology really help or what is the role in this whole passing on memories and storytelling? Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting question. I think I mentioned fairy tales during my session, and mythology is a very similar kind of function in terms of how they become some kind of an effective chronoton to which certain space-time are condensed together through certain figures, right? Because if we take a look at myth, we find that attributes play a very important role in myths. A mythical hero or a mythical villain has a series of attributes, which is sometimes excessive in quality, which is sometimes villainous in quality, etc. But there is a certain kind of embellishment, hyperbole, exaggeration, which work in mythologies. And the reason being that mythologies become some kind of a vessel for human emotions, which are condensed in such a way that it can be passed on from generation to generation. Now, I think what I'm trying to say is there's a very interesting interplay of fixity and plasticity in mythologies. So for every myth to become effective, it must have some fixed attributes, right? It must have some hyperbolic attributes, exaggerated attributes, etc. But at the same time, the myth in itself should be plastic in a sense that it should be molded, moldable to other kinds of medium for a myth to survive. So Mahabharata should be able to be translated into a graphic novel for Mahabharata to be studied even today. So there are these timeless quality about myth, there's also a plastic quality about myth. Now, we sometimes tend to focus more on the timeless bit and less on the plastic bit. But for any myth to survive the test of time, and that we can think of many myths which died out, for instance. I mean, the myth of Gilgamesh, for instance. I mean, it is read only by literary scholars, not so much by, there are no films on Gilgamesh, at least I'm not aware of it, or no popular representations of the Sumerian myth, right? So there is a quality of fixity and plasticity, timelessness and applicability in myths, which is interesting. And in terms of how to locate that in memory studies, I think it becomes a vessel of collective memory, but it's also some kind of an absorbing quality about myth. It must keep absorbing things as it passes on from generation to generation. So it has an organic quality, it has an absorbent quality, and interestingly, it also has a plastic quality. So every myth must be plastic. There should be a fluidity about myth. It must be able to flow into different kinds of medium. From the radio to the gramophone to the typewriter to cinema to Netflix, it must be able to keep moving across. So there's a deadless quality about myth. It must never die. But for that to happen, it must be able to keep evolving across different spectrums. So yeah, that would be my response. But thank you for that question.
Thank you so much.
We have Dr. Ruchi Sri. Ma'am, you have a question.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it was a very interesting session. My query is that I have been working on politics of water for almost 1.5 decades now. And I think memory has a very important role to play when it comes to politics of water, especially when we study, say, things like rivers and what is there in the collective consciousness of the people. So I was just wondering if you
I think there is a network lag.
Yeah, the network problem.
Yeah.
Network problem.
Maybe we can, in the meantime, take a question by Dr. Sandhya. Sorry, ma'am, we had.
Yeah, ma'am, can you hear us? Ruchi, ma'am?
Yes, I
Yeah,
can
please
hear you. Thank
continue
you.
with
Yeah,
your question. Please continue with your question.
Okay, so should I repeat my question or?
I think that'll be
because,
good. Yeah.
Okay. So I
Yeah.
was saying that I have been researching on politics of water for almost 1.5 decades now. So I started with social movements because even in movements, memory has an important role to play, how people look at their collective consciousness and the politics of natural resources. And now I'm working on this idea of rivers as commons and why we need to reclaim rivers as commons. So I was wondering if you would like to suggest some more readings.
Yeah, I think I got the crux of the question. Can I respond?
Yes, sir, please.
It's a very good question. And I think this is one direction of memory studies which is increasingly getting more and more prevalent and should get more and more prevalent. And that is, there is a study of more than human models of memory, right? In terms of looking at nature, like for instance, soil or rivers or mountains, and looking at the memory of those things rather than mediating it purely through a human engagement. And interestingly, very recently, I was in a session at my alma mater, Durham University, where we had an anthropologist who was talking about the memory of soil, right? So what happens if we study soil? What can that reveal about memories of that particular incident? So there's some study done on the soil of Auschwitz, where the Holocaust happened. So if you study soil of that particular place, what does that tell you? What new directions can that offer to memory studies? And I think my response to that would be, it's a very welcome move. I think that kind of model of memory, which is looking at not necessarily an anthropocentric model, but rather looking at a more material model, looking at a more natural model, looking at a more holistic model, or looking at a more planetary model to a certain extent, right? And that really leads on to very interesting questions about time and space as well, because our understanding of time is very, very human-centric, it's very anthropocentric, but it's also this question of planetary time. There's also the question of global time, the time of the planet, for instance. It's not to do with the time of human civilization. They're very different. So I think these kind of research, the memory of a river, for instance, the memory of a mountain, for instance. So these are very important questions in memory studies. Now, one theoretical framework that I find very interesting is a theory of material engagement theory, or MET, right? And that's something which is increasingly fascinating, especially in memory studies, in terms of looking at materials and what can materials offer in terms of understanding of society, culture, memory, etc. So Lumbris Malafuris has this very interesting book called How Things Shape the Mind, right? And I think that's a very useful book, especially for research in this direction, looking at memory of a particular culture through a river, right? Memory of a particular culture through a mountain. And of course, there are so many oral narratives one can collect, fisherman narratives of a river, narratives about people who live in a certain community in a mountain. What does that tell us about the mountain, right? So I think that's a very, very interesting research that can happen and should happen in memory studies. But I think my quick response to your question is we could benefit a lot by looking at material engagement theory in terms of how materials reflect human engagement with nature, whether it's a mountain or a river, or and that can also connect in very interesting ways to study of disasters, right? For instance, natural disasters, or even human disasters. For instance, for example, someone wants to study in the memory of Hiroshima, right? What happened after the bomb? What happened, at that time? So I think disaster studies and memory studies can connect very well together by looking not just as humans, but also looking at objects, looking at soils, looking at mountains, looking at bombed buildings. So I think that is one very, very interesting direction the memory studies is taking and should take in the times to come, I think.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. We have one more question here from Sandhya Tamang. And she's asking, sir, is there similarities in the way people think and create stories in different cultures?
Yeah, I mean, I guess yes and no. I mean, because in some sense, there are some universal elements which get replayed, some human emotions which get replayed. Every culture will have, for instance, feud stories. Feud is a very important part of any culture. Two families fighting for something. That we see that story done again and again, whether from ancient myths to Bollywood. We find this family feud is a very important thing. But I think what we should be doing in memory studies is look at the cultural differences in terms of how there are certain universal similarities, certain universal emotions like jealousy, anger, resentment, love, etc., hope, but how those emotions get played out in different discourses through different diagrams. And I think this in a way connects to the earlier question by Dr. Ruchi Sri, because every culture will have its unique geography as well. Now, sometimes we pay too much attention to history when looking at memory, right? But I think we ought to pay a lot of attention to geography as well. For a culture which is cold, the metaphors of memory will be very different from a culture which is tropical in quality, right? For a culture which is mountainous, we'll have very different metaphors of memory from a culture which is riverine, for instance, right? So the choice of metaphor, the vessel through which memory is communicated and described and literalized, whether it's in poetry or lyric or whatever, would depend on the geography of the culture as well. The physical dimension of the culture, right? Is it situated in a higher altitude or low altitude? Is it tropical or non-tropical? Is it Mediterranean? Is it riverine? So for instance, when Dr. Ruchi was talking about water, it is such a potent metaphor, water, right? It can be a metaphor for abundance, it can be a metaphor of life, it can also be a metaphor of poverty, of scarcity, of fight, of violence, right? So for instance, I live in Chennai at the moment, and I grew up in Calcutta. The way water is received and consumed as an object, as well as a metaphor, is very different in Chennai from the way it is consumed in Calcutta and other parts of India, for instance, simply because of the geographical difference between Chennai and Kolkata. So I think geography plays a very important role in memory studies. The physicality of a place, the terrain of a place, the topography of a place would also determine the shape of memory, right? So I think that's something which we should pay attention to. Thank you.
So while I was listening to you, I was just kind of wondering that which memory is more overpowering, the memory of trauma and disaster or the happy memories?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question because I mean, my very quick answer would be the one with the higher emotive quotient, right? Because it depends, even scientifically, in terms of how a memory gets encoded, depends largely on the emotional investment, right? So the higher the emotional quotient, the greater the chance of the encoding to happen, for something to be encoded into a neural pattern, which can get consolidated as a memory. The more emotional investment is there, the more the encoding will take place. And the reason why trauma gets more highlighted in these discourses, because happiness is something which is some kind of an exaggeration or some kind of a consolidation of ordinariness. So ordinary things become beautiful and happy, and that just becomes a memory in a certain sense. The reason why traumatic memory gets more scientific attention is because there is a sense of rupture in trauma, right? There's a sense of interruption in trauma. So what happens in trauma is there are two possibilities in trauma. One is it gets highlighted into a very, very intense memory, or the other thing which can happen, which is more medical in quality, is it can clinically kill memory to a certain extent, that you forget to remember, or it can produce forgetting in a certain sense, right? And this in a way connects to Sir's question earlier in terms of silences, because there's a lot of work done on traumatic memory, but there's one figure that I would recommend that, it's a bit of an understudied figure. Was a contemporary of Freud, someone called Pierre Janet, Janet. He was the one who, popularized the term traumatic memory to a large extent. He had a very interesting concept of traumatic memory and narrative memory. Now, he said there's a difference between traumatic memory and narrative memory, in a sense that for a traumatic memory to become narrative memory, there must be a temporal gap, right? So you find that oftentimes survivors of trauma, survivors of violence, don't want to talk about it, don't want to remember it, right? Until the point where they have a certain kind of time frame that they're able to now put that into a story. They're able to put that into a narrative, right? And that happens a lot in Holocaust literature and Holocaust scholarship and any kind of trauma scholarship, PTSD scholarship as well. We find soldiers, they don't want to talk about that. And, there's a reluctance and a resistance towards narrative to a certain extent, right? So I think traumatic memory is more complex to a certain extent because it can intensify memory. It can also create a rupture of memory, which can literally de-ontologize memory. It can reshape the way memory works in certain ways. But I would recommend that you read up Janet. It's a very interesting figure in this.
Thank you, sir. So are there any more questions? Anybody who wants to interact or ask any questions?
There are no more questions, I think.
Okay, so may I then formally conclude this session, sir?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So,
Yes, Shruti, should we conclude the session?
Yes.
Yeah.
so should I just go ahead and propose the formal vote of thanks?
Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, sir, on behalf of the entire organizing team and all the participants. It's a great pleasure and honor to extend a formal vote of thanks. You had taken out time this evening to join us, and you have thrown in some very interesting and fascinating concepts, which I'm sure some of our participants will take forward and may conduct further research. And some of the things that I found very fascinating was these concepts of remembering, forgetting, imagination, and fabrication, and how they are all intertwined and interconnected. And also the other concept about Herman's idea of cultures evolving through chunks, and how certain privileged chunks are the ones that become popular stories. And we do see it very often that it is only the ones that are privileged, and the minorities part of the chunk, they probably do not get reflected in the whole mainstream popular story stories in that sense. And that has happened, I think, in many places, and I think it happens across cultures. And it's definitely true that cultures evolve through storytellings, and how brain also works in a similar fashion when we chunk in certain information and we chunk out certain information. So very, very fascinating. And your examples about the 300 movie and Rang De Basanti and all of that, and how we look at those movies from the perspective of storytelling and memory and all of that. So thank you so much, sir, for taking out this time and joining us today evening. And it has been a great session. And I would also want to take this opportunity to thank the entire organizing team and the technical assistance provided for the smooth streaming of the session. Thank you so much. And all the participants who have joined in through YouTube and on Zoom, and have taken this opportunity to both benefit from this lecture and interact with you. Thank you so much, the participants as well. Have a very good evening and a fruitful week ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks, sir. Unmute কৰি কলো নহয় গম পালে চাগে ন?
Who's going to use Chronoton?
From live streaming. Nidhi, can you stop the live streaming, please? I don't know.
Let me just call her.
Anmol, switch it off. Live बंद कर दो.